Hi, I'm Karolina Pashkova. I'm in charge of the gallery program now, and I will tell shortly something about the gallery. If you let me, I prepared a short presentation in PowerPoint after 10 years. So can just someone confirm me that you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, tonight we have a lecture of Canadian architect Matthew Sauls, who will speak about his recently published book, but I'll come to it to the introduction later. I just wanted to mention that it's organized by the Faculty of Architecture at the Brno University of Technology, which is running the Gallery of Architecture since 2020. And the program is financially supported by the Ministry of Culture and the Foundation of Czech Architecture. So thank you. There was in October and November, we presented an exhibition, a project of a Hungarian architect and artist, Antti Schmidt, who was working or who went to New York and was stunned by the tall skyscrapers and very expensive skyscrapers. And so she did kind of a photos project about it. These are a few photos from the exhibition, which is now actually closed, but this lecture somehow relates to it because it is very similar topic. And if you missed the exhibition, you can check in this book, which was published last year, where she presents. So basically, she created an alter ego and of a lady, a wife of a Hungarian billionaire who is checking the New York's Manhattan's expensive flats because they want to move to New York with her family, and that was the way how she could actually visit these super expensive units, which often serves only like many of them only for the speculation. And I highly recommend the book. There are not only her photos, but also essays from different authors and academicians and architects. So check it out. You can also get it in like bookshops, also in Brno, for example, Book Therapy. And these are some of the photos of the flats. I'll show you also this one because there was a review which noticed that basically in every flat there needs to be a individually standing bathtub. Without that, you don't have an obviously an expensive unit. And I wanted to mention that also one of the essays from the book was translated and available at the exhibition. It was also published on the Czech media Deník Referendum, so you can read it. I highly recommend it. It's by an American geographer, Sam Stein, who writes about, like, he basically poses questions to the investors who speculate with these flats, and he asks them how do they feel about it, how do they perceive these buildings and so on, and how did they influence the skyline of Manhattan. Originally, of course, it was written in English. It's also published online if you want to check it rather in English. Samuel Stein, I just wanted to mention, it's a great book. Published, I think, also 2020 or 2019 by Verso publisher. But I'll use this opportunity also to invite you to another lecture, which we are going to hold next week. It's a British artist, Laura Yule, who has a project, Asset Arrest. She does podcasts where she visits, similarly as Antti Schmidt did, expensive real estates. She usually invite another guest, some expert on housing, and they discuss the meaning, or like they discuss the development and so on. And so she will give a lecture on Monday, 20th December at 7 p.m. Also online. So all are welcome. And also we are planning another exhibition, which starts officially next week on 22nd of December. It's a project of Austrian architect Gabo Heindl. It's going to be a growing exhibition where she will present her manifesto for housing. So you can check it out. It's going to stay in the gallery until 17th of there was a mistake. 17th of February in next year. And there will be also another accompanying lectures. First one on Wednesday, 22nd, by Gabo Heindl, where she will speak mainly about the Viennese housing. And then we are planning 5 another lectures about housing in different cities, including Vancouver. So I'm happy to, like, if anyone becomes interested, and join us also at the other events. But not to forget, we are here tonight for the lecture of Matthew Stoll, who is associate professor at the at the University of British Columbia. He's graduate of the Harvard University Graduate School of Design, and he's also the founder and director of Matthew Stoll's Architecture. Recently, and that's why we are here, he published in 2021 a book called Icebergs, Zombies, and the Ultra Thin: Architecture and Capitalism in the 21st Century, which he will present tonight. So now I'll give him the word. Thank you, Matthew. We are really delighted you accepted the invitation, and we are looking for the discussion. So after the presentation, the floor will be open and anyone can join and ask. Matthew, thank you. It's yours.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll share my screen here. Give me 1 second. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Carolina, for the introduction and the opportunity to spend some time with you all today. And thanks for everyone to come. Really exciting to hear about all the things that are happening at your gallery. And this kind of seems like a concerted effort and program around kind of the challenges of contemporary capitalism and housing. So it's really interesting. I'm super excited to come to these talks. Before I get, who's going to give the talk on Vancouver? Now I'm curious. You're going to have a talk coming up on Vancouver?
Yes, actually, this was created by the Austrian architect Gabo Heindl, and I'm not sure. I think she mentioned some community housing group, but I didn't manage to note it down. So I can't tell you more, but I'll send you the invitation once we know it.
Awesome. But anyway, really exciting that you're all doing this there. That's great. Okay, so yeah, so as Carolina said, I'm going to give a presentation organized around my recent book, and really, you know, my book is about capitalism in the 21st century, and really how it's dominated by a specific mode of capitalism, and that is finance capitalism. So the book is a kind of examination of architecture operating as an asset within finance capitalism. And finance and its associated practices have been around since the inception of capitalism. And different thinkers have positioned and conceptualized finance capitalism in various ways, in different ways. So for instance, Giovanni Arrighi, the Italian economist, described the history of capitalism as having 4 hegemons, each defined by their major city. So Genoa, Amsterdam, London, and then the current hegemon period defined by New York City. And interestingly, in Arrighi's mind, you know, as a certain period of capitalist hegemony occurs or arises, it does through a material accumulation. But as it declines, it's connected to financial expansion. So in Arrighi's view, we were in the fourth major kind of hegemon connected to New York City, but we're in its period of decline that is marked by an increase of financed capitalist behavior, modalities, practices. A different view is Kostas Lapavitsas, the Greek economist. He sees in the history of capitalism two great financial ascendancies. So the first financial ascendancy starting in the late 19th century and then going until the interwar years in the 1930s. And then the second financial ascendancy starting in around 1980 and continuing to the present. So in Lapavitsas' view, we are in the second great financial ascendancy. Frederick Jameson, in contrast, the American philosopher and political theorist, he's more interested in seeing a kind of continuous cycle within capitalism that has always been present and is defined by three moments. So the first moment in this continuous cycle is accumulation of money through trade. And then the second, capital is then invested in agriculture and manufacture. And then the third moment, marked by speculation. So for Arrighi or for Jameson, he kind of described this as an epidemic of epidemics, this kind of movement between these three moments. So while people like Arrighi, Lapavitsas, and Jameson offer different positions of finance over history, they all actually agree that something significant happened around 1980. So here is a quote from Frederick Jameson, a very important, I think, in this topic, essay that he wrote in 1998 called The Brick and the Balloon, Architecture, Idealism, and Land Speculation. He says that, I think everyone will agree that finance capital is one of the distinctive features of late capitalism, or in other words, of the distinctive state of things today. So, what exactly is finance capitalism? Financialization. I'm quite fond of this definition that's offered by the American sociologist Greta R. Krippner. Greta R. Krippner did some really meticulous work describing in through data and very close scrutiny of financial information the move in the American economy to financial modes of profit production. But anyway, what she is just going to read this. Her definition is for financialization, a pattern of accumulation in which profits accrue primarily through financial channels rather than through trade and commodity production. Financial here refers to activities relating to the provision or transfer of liquid capital in expectation of future interest, dividends, or capital gains. And that phrase or concept, liquid capital, is quite important. And just remember that. And I'm going to come back to the idea of liquidity in a little bit, because I think that that's key to kind of understanding our contemporary moment. So the sort of financialization in the 1980s to the present era can be demonstrated in many, many ways. So you can look at the size and volumes of currency markets. You can look where firms get their profits. Or here, you can look at a very basic measurement, the total value or capitalization of all the world's companies that are on all the world's stock exchanges. So in 1980, in constant dollars at the lower left there, you see a little dot representing 1.7 trillion US dollars. And by 2018, that has, in constant dollars, kind of exploded to $68 trillion. Now, part of the story of financialization is that there truly is a radically unprecedented amount of money in the world. So what is sometimes called the giant pool of money or the great wall of money. So here is a measurement of global assets under management. So this is financial money that is in things like mutual funds, hedge funds, somehow being managed by financial specialists. And, you know, from 1980, it goes from about $12 trillion, again, in constant, to, you know, about 80 million in 2010, and it is now said to be about $101 trillion. So this giant pool of money is critical for architecture because architecture is a preferred medium of finance and speculation. So to go back to Arrighi, a quote from his book, The Long 20th Century, that came out in 2010, then as now, so then being these kind of earlier hegemons like in Genoa or Amsterdam in those financial ascendancies. So then as now, a significant portion of capital tended to flow into speculation and into conspicuous consumption. And then as now, investment in real estate within capitalist cities themselves were the most important means of combining speculation with conspicuous consumption. Now, I think all of this kind of capital, giant pool of money that goes into the spaces of architecture because of the spaces of architecture being a preferred medium of finance and speculation, produces unique mode of architecture, something that we might call asset architecture or finance capitalist architecture. And in the book that I argue that we could identify sort of broad general characteristics of finance capitalist architecture. And the 5 prominent ones, in my opinion, are that it is inherently unstable and creates spaces of crises. So as architecture becomes more enmeshed within the markets and their vicissitudes, their kind of characteristics of increasing and decreasing, and the in growth and decay, produces all sorts of kind of crisis space. And of course, the 2007-2008 financial crisis gives us no shortage of examples of crisis space. So this is a luxury housing development, luxury in quotes, on the outskirts of Las Vegas in Nevada. And it has sit abandoned like this since 2008. There are now kind of eerily a handful of mansions on these kind of pads, but it is a like an almost Egyptian pharaonic scale of earthwork, and kind of communicates a certain kind of intensity and violence of the kind of alterations of the earth that these speculative developments take place or occur through. But of course, Ireland and the infamous ghost estates, as seen here, and these kind of construction hoardings that have become semi-permanent. And then Spain, again, with no shortage of examples as represented here that continue to this day. I mean, it's, you know, like we're almost, I mean, we're very far out, many years out from 2008, and you can still visit these abandoned or half-completed projects in Spain. So the second broad characteristic is that it is increasingly, or it increasingly functions as speculative wealth storage. And examples of this can be found in many places, and unique architectural manifestations. And this is where this mutation notion really can be well understood. So, for example, iceberg homes, most notoriously present in London. So here we're seeing an image of a proposed extension in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. But these can be found elsewhere. They're starting to pop up in Canadian cities, for example, for different logics, because there's, in different settings, there's different narratives for why they occur. But underlying these different narratives, I think, is always this imperative to store this aspects of this giant pool of money in architectural manifestations. And these are images taken from the subterranean interiors of these iceberg homes. There's often pools, and because, of course, they're subterranean, the architectural detailing of lighting, I think, is very fascinating. The kind of proliferation of kind of recesses and coves, and generating a certain sort of ambiance. There's often private movie theaters, private recreation spaces. Again, these are all images taken from subterranean spaces in London. Number three is that finance capitalist architecture is the means of uneven development and heightened inequality. Because of course, one of the disturbing stories of the era of financialization is the growing division and extreme gap between the very wealthy and the poor. And this is manifest in built space, and you can describe it in a whole host of ways. Right here are two images of what really can be understood to be the same project. So on the left is a photograph of an interior of a condominium kitchen in Vancouver, in a tower designed by Bjarke Ingels, and the name of the tower is Vancouver House. And if you're curious about what the shape of the exterior massing is, it really, you can see this island here is a scale version of the massing of the tower turned on its side. So the bottom is this smaller triangle that then metamorphoses to this larger rectangle. So it's a top-heavy building that seems like it will fall. And on the right is a series of homes that were built for quote unquote families in need in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Why these can be understood as the same project is that when Vancouver House was marketed, one of its marketing components was what was called the world's first one-to-one home gifting program. And so for every condominium unit that was bought in Vancouver House, one home for a family in need was built in Phnom Penh. So that's what we're seeing on the right. So each stair here is one home. And so there was a literal kind of spatial philanthropic program that connects these two programs, but illustrates, I think, some of the very perverse ethical dimensions around inequality in the era of finance capitalism. So I would say that number four is that finance capitalist architecture has a simultaneous propensity for being highly iconic and extremely standardized. So here in Torreviejo, Spain, we see in the foreground an abandoned and burned out shell of a Toyo Ito project that has a kind of, particular shape that I think we could describe as aspiring to iconicism. And in the background, or the midground and background, are large expanses of highly standardized and repetitive housing. And I think we could argue that the two sort of, or iconicism and standardization are working together in a spatio-financial ecology in which the iconicism is used to sort of generate a certain degree of speculative attraction for the standardized housing projects that exist behind it. But of course, sometimes iconicism and standardization and homogenization exist simultaneously within the same building, same project. So here is Herzog and de Meuron's, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, well-known project in Tribeca, Manhattan, 56 Leonard. On the left is an image from a marketing poster that went along with the tower. And I think the kind of the poster sort of emphasizes the way in which there's a sort of simultaneity of iconicism and standardization. So last is that finance capitalist architecture increases liquidity. And again, I mentioned this earlier when we were looking at Greta Krippner's comment or definition of financialization, the importance of liquidity. So I want to dive into this one a little bit more. So what is liquidity? Going from a very straightforward and generic source that is at the center, I think, of logics about investment and finance, Investopedia.com. Liquidity refers to the efficiency or ease with which an asset or security can be converted into ready cash without affecting its market price. So the most liquid asset of all is cash itself. But very interestingly, this is a screen grab from the kind of introductory tutorial on liquidity from Investopedia.com. And it's interesting, if you're interested in this, I encourage you to watch this video, but it's typical of many descriptions of liquidity. And to help explain the concept, the descriptions usually involve saying, well, what is not liquid? So we'll help you understand what liquidity is by telling you what its opposite is. And one of the always present descriptions in these tutorials and definitions of what is not liquid is what we're seeing on the screen right now. So it's a version, it's a manifestation of architecture, right? Described through the abstraction of the phrase real estate. So real estate is thought to be totally illiquid or very illiquid. And it's interesting, this representation. So we see, a structure that is freestanding, looks like a single family home of some type. The door is visible from the ground. There's the implication of landscape in some trees and shrubs. It's got a sloped roof, a series of windows. So this is the opposite of cash. So really, we can, of course, understand liquidity on a spectrum in which the illiquid real estate and therefore architecture is at one end and cash is at the other. Now, one of the common phrases or credos that is associated with real estate is all real estate is local. And I think that connects very strongly to why real estate is understood to be so non-liquid or illiquid. So this idea of locality or local specificity is really key here, right? And so when you think about it, cash can be handed off, like every US dollar bill or every 10 euro note is exactly the same as every other note, can be handed off fast and efficiently. But real estate or a piece of architecture, is designed always a little bit differently by a different architect. It sits on a specific territory on the earth that is always unique sunlight, unique weather conditions, the block, who are the neighbors, is it noisy? What's the street life like? Is there crime? Is there not crime? On and on and on, right? And it's always been understood that to be a responsible investor in real estate, one has to be acquainted with all of those local specificities. And that is a time-consuming process. There's no easy way to do cross comparisons, at least historically. And that time-consuming process is a huge thing that makes it local and also not liquid, unlike the cash. So my argument is that giant pool of money that goes into architecture and real estate in the era of finance capitalism puts a huge amount of pressure on architecture to move along the spectrum of liquidity and become more like cash. And actually, it's important to say that within this spectrum, there are such things, of course, as stock equities. And those are not as liquid as cash, but they typically are far more liquid than real estate. So we're moving real estate in the logics of finance capitalism towards liquidity that is more stock equity-like or more cash-like. And so how does this move along the liquidity spectrum occur? It occurs in a whole host of ways. Some of them are the invention of new financial instruments proper that are tethered and connected to real estate. I'm not going to go into details of them right now for the interest of time, but real estate investment trusts and mortgage-backed securities are relatively recent inventions that help move real estate along the spectrum. Now, there are also laws that are invented, and I think the condominium laws that come into effect in Canada, the United States, Australia, and many other countries in the 1960s, but don't become kind of popularly deployed until the 1980s, are key here. Because it's important to understand that, say, in New York City, where Andy has done that such great work on looking at the pencil towers, no one could own directly a piece of architecture, a piece of real estate in the sky until condominium laws were created in the 1960s. Before that, the only way you could own real estate was through its direct connection to the land. So it actually was based on the land. So you could own a single family home that sat on the land. You could own a townhouse or a row house that again was connected to the land. You could own an entire multi-floor building, right? 10 stories, 50 stories. You could own the whole thing, but you couldn't separately own something on the 10th or 20th or 50th floor until condominium laws. And I think that's key in the sort of simplification and homogenization and movement towards cash. In 1975, in the 1970s, you start to have global real estate brokerages. So this is a very simple thing, but I think very key, right? Because they help make buying and selling real estate at a global scale easier. All of this gets supercharged, I think, starting in the 2000s with the advent of what is called property technology or prop technology. We start to have apps on our phones that allow us to make easy cross comparisons of real estate investment assets in different locations across the world. And we start seeing and interacting with our spaces differently. But all of this occurs in concert with changes to the physical form of architecture, right? So the changes are in financial instruments, legal frameworks, buying and selling practices, technology, but then form itself. So, so we can say in a way that there are forms of finance, right? And you know, and in the book I talk about five of them, and I've already alluded a little bit to iceberg homes, number one, the sort of vehicles of speculative wealth storage. Touched a little bit about financial icons, the attractors that work within spatio-financial ecologies. Number two, ex-urban investment mats. So these are self-similar housing units that are homogenized, standardized, and in vast numbers that cover increasingly large expanses of horizontal expanses of the earth, right? And you know, their standardization makes them more like currency, and their large numbers literally expands the numbers of assets in a market. And actually, one of the things about liquidity is that the more assets that are in a market, the market itself becomes more liquid. Number three, I think is a very interesting one, are super podiums. Now, podiums have existed for a long time. I mean, as long as there's been things to put on top of podiums, we've had podiums. But I think their role has been supercharged in the era of finance capitalism. And my argument is that by placing the units of housing in towers above podiums that we see in lots of cities, not in all cities, but in quite a few cities, those units are effectively less localized. So they disentangle the units from the messy unpredictability of the public. So the new territories of the podiums, tops, are a kind of universal plane, allowing architectural assets to be almost universally interchangeable on top of them. Now, number four, the pencil tower is a kind of apotheosis of simplification and facilitating remote ownership, which is a key dimension here. So you can find no shortage of these ex-urban investment mats. So here is one popping up in Las Vegas, and they sort of pop up in these increments. And notice how close the space is between the ostensibly separate sort of American dream of the single family home. But here is in, you know, the Mediterranean coast of Spain, where we see Northern European vacation desires meeting with speculative investment aspirations to create an almost lava-like flow over the landscape. And here is San Buenaventura on the edges of Mexico City. And Mexico perhaps has the most dramatic examples of self-similar radical homogeneity in these ex-urban investment mats. Here is Ensenada in Baja California, different type of self-similar investment mats. And here are an example of the quote-unquote backyards in Durango, Mexico. All these photos, these three photos, by the way, are taken by a really great photographer named Livia Corona Benjamin. Here's a super podium roof plan in Turkish Zorlu Center in Istanbul. I think it's kind of interesting that the towers of housing units are sort of represented in white, almost capturing their interchangeability and abstraction. Here's a view of the project and a kind of closer zoomed in, this kind of private roof plane here, taking on the guise of a sort of naturalism, romantic naturalism. And then we see the sort of other city below, but the units of investment sort of sitting above this new plane. Here is Icon Brickell project by Architectura in downtown Miami. So these are condominium units that sit on the top of a vast podium that, in the case of Miami, because it's Miami, is a large kind of recreational expanse. And I mean, this is an incredibly large series of swimming pools. Now, of course, the towers and thinness, this kind of march to the ultra thin, is such a prominent aspect to the era of finance capitalism. So, and this is nowhere witnessed as strongly than of course New York City. And I mean, here we're sort of seeing, you know, buildings. New York has had tall buildings for a long time, but it's without argument that there has been this march towards extreme height in combination with incredible slenderness. And then we arrive at something like the very right, which is Shop Architects 111 West 57th, which is a remarkable, I mean, it's a remarkable construct, right? I mean, it's, you know, it's the world's second tallest residential tower. It has a slenderness ratio of 1 to 23 or 1 to 24, depending on who you're listening to. And it only has 58 units, which is, you know, unbelievable, right? I mean, so all of the units are either one entire floor or 2 floors or 3 floors. Now, I would say this is about the radically simplified unit of investment. That we see it so clearly here. So this is moving very far along the spectrum towards cash and stock-like liquidity. So this unit requires minimal security and minimal maintenance at the scale of ownership. Of course, the tower means one single controlled access point at the ground. The condominium management structure collectivizes maintenance. But in terms of form and programming, problems at the scale of the unit are absolutely minimized. So if you remember that picture of the single family home from that Investopedia you know, tutorial, there's, you know, in that project, there's the pitched roof that needs to be maintained because sometimes it leaks, it breaks down. Someone has to maintain the yard, you know, mow the lawn, clip the trees. None of that exists here, right? There's one roof for 58 units. There's no garden to look after. And there's no real risk of someone breaking into the unit or vandalizing it. Like if you don't visit this unit for years, maybe you never physically inhabit it, you're reasonably assured that it will be just fine. So it's actually something that needs no bodily contact. And I think this is really, really important. So it's a simplified, disentangled territory that's completely different than the messy and managed territory of the ground. So I think it's a protected post-social asset. Here is a kind of plan of a one floor, a unit that would exist on one entire floor. And of course, the elevator deposits you directly in the unit. So gone is the shared horizontal circulation space, and with it, any possibility of a chance encounter with other human beings. So it's another way in which the ultra thin is a kind of post-social architecture. But, you know, it would be a mistake to think that ultra thinness, that form, but also that ethos, can only be found in the towers of Midtown Manhattan. I think its morphology and ethos can be found elsewhere, right? I mean, it can literally be found in thin, tall towers in places like Vancouver or Melbourne, but it can also be found not only in tall towers. Like take One Hyde Park in London. In a way, we could understand this as 4 thin towers that have been chopped and arrayed across the ground in 4 segments. Because when you look at the operational diagrams by the architects, and so this is, you know, one of the primary operational diagrams, it is entirely about post-social isolation. Like, it's all like elevators deposit you directly in your unit. And everything is done through shape and detailing to assure that you will never have a glance or any notion of neighborliness, that you would even know that there are neighboring units, and that drives the whole game. Now, let's not forget that many of these spaces that I've been speaking about are effectively empty much of the time. So this is One Hyde Park at night. You know, and this is because these units are functioning largely as second, third, fourth, and fifth homes for very wealthy entities, families, individuals, or entities. Now, this kind of challenge of zombie urbanism, owned but empty inhabitation, is a worldwide phenomena, of course, right? Different measurements from different places around the world. Cities have been trying to confront this challenge in various ways. I mean, Paris, for instance, enacted a second home tax in 2015. Toronto's second or vacant home tax will come into effect in 2023. You know, and you know, the president, or Xi Jinping, the leader of China in 2017, you know, underscoring the challenges in his country, you know, announced at the 19th Party Congress, which is a very important venue, of course, that houses are built to be inhabited, not for speculation. So I think it's this is all pointing to the fact that physical inhabitation, which is really at the traditional core conception of architecture as a construct that provides shelter for living, breathing humans, is diminished by finance capitalism. Now, this is an event in Toronto, Canada, where a condo project is being launched. So we see the renderings, and this a projection with a series of renderings up on a big screen. And the people here are all the brokers and marketing people that are going to go out and sell this unit. Now, what's very interesting is that in many jurisdictions, and Toronto is one of them, investors can buy an assignment to purchase a unit before construction starts. And in many cases, what this translates to, many, many years before a building is finished and ready for occupation. So you can buy something 5 years out, 6 years out, you know, 4 years out, so on and so forth, these assignments. And these pre-sale assignments are not legally real estate sales, so they are comparatively hidden. There's no sort of, they're kind of cloaked in secrecy. But quite fascinatingly, they can be then exchanged and sold in a market that I would argue like sits in parallel to the physical necessity of the building, right? And these sales are a dramatic example of a hyper speculative architectural market, right? So they are almost always done for speculative profit. And there's an urban mythology of condo sales, in fact, in cities like Vancouver and Toronto, where outside the pre-sale centers, there's lineups. There's, you know, it's literally people often camp overnight for multiple nights to buy the pre-sale assignments. And then you can buy them, the mythology is you can buy them and walk to the back of the line and sell them to someone at the back of the line for like, you know, $50,000 profit. Now, effectively, I think the pre-sales market is a version of an architectural futures market in which floor plans and renders operate as financial assets. The physical structure of the building is diminished in significance, right? Architecture moves in this way even closer to the utopia of finance capitalism, that of heightened liquidity. So from this vantage point, we can think of digital rendering software as financial technology or fintech, because after all, from a certain vantage point, the thing that is ultimately being exchanged in a pre-sales market are the renderings, are the kind of visualizations of something physical that does not yet exist. Now, this is a photograph of 432 Park Avenue by Raphael Vignoli. You know, each of the four facades are exactly identical, made up of 10 by 10 meter windows in this perfect extrusion of a square. It has a 1:15 slenderness ratio. It's the third highest building in New York City by roof heights. And by all reports, the building is largely empty at any given moment. Not completely empty, but owned and inhabited or partially inhabited, right? So this conveys, again, a very crucial point, right? That financialization of architecture no longer requires inhabitation at all. So finance capitalist architecture is not ultimately, I think, about conspicuous consumption, but rather a new, relatively disembodied state of architecture. Now, and this is a elevation of 432 Park Avenue. Now, this here is an elevation of the top spire of the Woolworth building in New York City, which was finished in 1912, designed by Cass Gilbert. And when it was completed, it was the world's tallest building and existed so for 17 years. It was a command and control center for industrial capitalism, a mode of capitalism in which goods are produced and sold at markup, very different than finance capitalism, right? But in the era of finance capitalism, something very interesting happens in many cities. The tallest buildings become relatively thin and tall condominium towers. So that's happened in New York City, right? The tallest building by roof height are now condominium towers, not control and command centers of industrial capitalism. It's happened in Vancouver, for instance. It's happened in a tremendous number of cities. So what does it ultimately mean when the tallest buildings of the land are no longer office spaces where people physically come together to work, but are rather private units that are speculative wealth storage assets, many of them effectively empty? Now, for most of history, what were considered towers at any given time, interestingly, were largely empty, not intended for regular inhabitation. So here on the screen is a depiction of Zoroastrian towers of silence from the late 18th century. Dead bodies were brought to the top to be excarnated by birds. And in fact, towers prior to the advent of industrial capitalism were very often spiritual in nature. They were constructs that explicitly mediated between the physical present and presence and an immaterial spiritual transcendence and physical absence. Now, you know, if we think so many people have conceptualized capitalism in religious and spiritual terms. So, for instance, Walter Benjamin has said, capitalism is a pure religious cult, perhaps the most extreme there ever was. Now, I'm glad that Carolina in the beginning in her introduction, showed some images of the freestanding bathtubs that are in so many of these towers. I mean, here is a prominent rendering image that was used in the marketing of 432 Park Avenue. And I mean, this bathtub thing is really, I think, remarkable. And its presence in the marketing is really remarkable. And you can see these bathtubs now in marketing campaigns for spaces around the world, you know, this kind of, and so they're all self-similar, right? So what's going on here? So I think the empty bathtub calls forth the body, of course, the naked body, the totally alone body, and I would say the totally socially disentangled body. So the body of finance capitalism is isolated and entirely private. Yet the emptiness of the bathtub also emphasizes that the body isn't even a requisite. So Reinhold Martin, the American architectural historian, has used the term real virtualities. And I think what we are witnessing in images like this and projects like this are the kind of real virtualities for the dominant spiritual practice of today, a condition where the sheltering corporeal function of architecture is de-emphasized to allow it to operate optimally as a preferred medium of finance. So that's my end. That's it. I will stop sharing, I guess. That way I can see you all.
Perfect. Thanks. Are you there?
I'm here, yeah. I guess
Okay.
my
Good.
camera on.
Yeah, perfect.
Am I no longer sharing screen?
Exactly. Thank you. It was an exciting presentation. Probably I'll start with the questions, but if anyone wants to join in, maybe raise the hand. There is a button. I hope everyone sees it, and then we try to moderate it somehow. Anyway, I'm wondering for a long time, actually, and you presented it nicely, like if we have these, like as an architect, or like as architects are working on these buildings, they are, and most of them, let's talk about the residential buildings, let's say, and so they design it in a way, like I'm wondering if they still have the person living there in mind when they design the floor plans, and if they imagine like how the family will live there or not. Because I mean, if they are planning or like designing a building and planning that it will be a medium for speculation, or there will be actually living someone, because that, I mean, the use of the architecture should somehow set the form of the architecture, and you show that maybe not necessarily, because it, I mean, if it's somehow clear that the buildings will be empty and not used anymore, I mean, with what in mind do you as an architect design these kind of buildings? And I like the that you mentioned this relationship between liquidity and illiquidity of the real estate, that somehow, I mean, do we need the buildings and at all? I mean, if the brokers or the investors actually only buy the unit, kind of a number somewhere on the stock market, and they never visited it, or they never, like, what's the purpose of the architecture in 3D if we don't use it? I mean, how it happened that this kind of architecture is being built? I don't know. I'm not sure if that's a question, but I'll still wonder what's the relationship for the architects between like how it's used and that it's not used, and that you don't. I mean, why do they then even work? Because the design and often even the name of the architect is part of the marketing of the building, but in the end, it's not you. I mean, the value of the architecture is not useful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even Andy Schmidt shows it nicely in the book, that she talks about how somehow awkward the viewings of the units were when, like, of course, like that the marketers, they were presenting her how unique the flat is, how like the best materials were used, but yeah, I mean, if no one uses it, then what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, no, you raise, I mean, it's very, very interesting. I mean, my sense is, I mean, think the architects involved in designing these projects, I think we have to understand, or I think it's helpful to, the same way it's helpful to understand like liquidity on a spectrum, the decision-making process on part of the design team also existing on in a kind of field of spectrums in a way. And my sense is that it's not that in actual human inhabitation and use has completely vanished in the decision-making spectrum or matrix of the designers. I think, though, that it has been diminished and decreased in relation to other prerogatives that are connected to investments, wealth storage, speculation, and all of that. And you know, one way that I think you can measure, I mean, to understand capitalism on capitalism's own terms, is to look at, like, of the people involved in the making of these buildings, like who gets paid, what different professions or people get paid different amounts. So in many, like, it's hard to super generalize this because there's so many differences in different cities and markets, but in many places, on the team that is involved with making the buildings, the marketers are paid way more than the architects, right? Like way more. And then if you take the logics of capitalism on its own values, that signifies radically that the marketers are thought to be way more important than the architects. And often the marketers are not people that are brought in at the end to just sell the stuff. They're brought in right at the beginning. So what the marketers with their expertise deem to be the most sellable characteristics are having a radical impact on like how these units are designed and how these buildings are shaped. But then of course we could say, well, is the marketer and the expertise he or she has completely disentangled or detached from use? I think it would be unrealistic to say it is, but it has a certain idea of use that's filtered through a very particular set of interests and ambitions, and that's playing a huge role in influencing the design of these buildings. I think it's fair to say that in most of these buildings, the architects have given up almost entirely any ambitions for architectural role in creating a kind of rich domestic life for the inhabitants. I don't think any of these buildings, like 432 Park or 111 or 432 Park Avenue, 1 Hyde Park, treat the architectural interior and inhabitation as a serious territory. I think they're all invested in simple things about isolation and abstraction for the inhabitants, and then basic metrics of what luxury and prestige is attached to. So it's about a diminished territory of what kind of furnishings or what kind of kitchen fixtures you have, what kind of materials on the countertop, and views. I mean, we kind of take for granted that views would be an obsession of building. But I actually think, I mean, yes, it seems like humans have liked views for a very long time. But when we look at kind of urban morphology and architectural prerogatives, it has not been the case that views have been almost a singular obsession as they are now. And I think the view plays a very particular role in the logics of finance capitalism. It's a very private and isolated experience. It also is something that can be represented quite easily as opposed to other kind of social or more socially rich things, and can be then represented by the marketers in an easy way, and kind of it's a kind of disembodied abstraction, I would argue. But anyway, that's a long thing. So but do we need the buildings anymore? I think
I wanted to ask this because you showed that if you can trade with the how is it called, pre-sale assignments,
yeah,
then do you need the buildings at all? I mean, if like the price is on the rendering, or the investors are actually looking at some brochures or Excel tables, I don't know, and decides and just need to save or like put their money or the investment into this. Cannot they just trade with the renderings? I mean, I don't know exactly what the NFT is, but it's obviously a trend now. So can architecture be only in this digital form, and then we save a lot of resources, and maybe make many communities happy that we don't use the space? Like, would these investments would they work without the form, without the material itself? And maybe now that's a stupid question, but there is this somehow clear relation that real estate is, I mean, the value or the price rise with the need. And real estate is so interesting because it's supposedly a need, like everyone needs to be housed.
Mm-hmm.
But these kind of buildings you've shown are somehow a proof that they are not meant for housing. Like they are not supposed to serve as like a space for someone's need. Like how comes it works that their value is so high if they have basically zero useful usefulness, if that makes sense?
No, I think it's a super interesting question and line of thinking. So, and well, one thing I'm going to try to answer your, or you raise a lot of issues. I think just very quickly as a side thing, I do think it's important that we don't over dramatize this. I mean, I mean, this is a very, in my mind, such an important topic because it relates to so many urgent things in our lives that's connected to homelessness and, you know, like these deep affordability crises that impact so many people's lives in very immediate and real ways. But at the same time, I don't think that something like 432 Park, I mean, 432 Park is not 100% empty, right? Like, so there are people living there. And so in a way, I mean, it's not that they're not designed completely without need. They are fulfilling a certain type of need, I think, if we understand need in a broad sense. I mean, it's for wealthy people. Some of them, it is their primary residence. But anyway, but so I think it's important that we're nuanced in this. It's quite complicated. But to your question about, I think, so pre-sale assignments, how they function now, we do in their conceptualization, they clearly need the eventuality of the building, right? Like, so for them to work, they are legally tied to the future reality of a physical construct. So if we right now we say, like, if we took that away, I think the market would collapse. But it's a very interesting thing though, right? Like, so if we say right now people are able to buy and sell renderings that are tethered to a future that is 7 years away. What if we just have a thought experiment? We say, okay, well, if it's working with 7 years, what if we extend it to 10 years? Was that, like, are people comfortable with that? Can we do that? Why not? Maybe we can if we can do it for 7. Can we do it for 15 years? Can we do it for 20 years? Can we invent some sort of spatio-legal instrument that actually permanently or indefinitely holds the potentiality of the building? Like, you know, like it's 25 years, 50 years, or just always being renegotiated, and therefore invent a kind of new spatio-legal financial construct that almost quarantines, in a way, speculative aspirations around the built environment and holds them in an immaterial space, and therefore liberates physical reality to be for hyper kind of socially rich, affordable life. It's, I think, a very interesting question. And then in parallel, I do think the NFT and metaverse phenomena that is happening and with rapid transformations every day poses some very interesting questions in this regard. I mean, of course, there are, so one of the answer to your question is, another answer is to say, it seems like we can have renderings, three-dimensional shape files that are shared electronically and experienced purely electronically, that can be hyper investments. I mean, there are millions and millions of dollars going into virtual real estate in the metaverse right now. And so can that be strategically positioned in such a way that would have benefit, for social benefit, for the challenges we have around real housing? Maybe, but I mean, one of the interesting things, I think, or challenges around the metaverse, is that almost entirely its logic right now is like hyper greed motivated speculation. And so, like, I mean, I'm very fascinated how we might be able to do things, these kind of spatio financial, legal, technological inventions that span the digital and the real, to somehow create social benefits that are challenges to the hyper financialized versions of themselves right now. But I don't think there are, of course, there are people working on this, but it's a very open-ended question whether it can happen.
Because basically, if I understood well, you mentioned that the pre-sale assignments, some of them are sold, are like bought and sold before the building is still built. So they are just changing papers or some numbers in the world. And okay, there is some promise of a future building, but it seems kind of not that important in the end. I mean, okay, there is the promise, but like the investors, are they then at all interested in the real, like the material building, or not necessarily? And then we can maybe like put all of these investors in some virtual market where they will change their numbers and will continue building cities for people. I don't know. But like, I mean, if there wasn't the need and the scarcity and the homelessness maybe, and like, would these virtual real estate then have any value? I don't know. But I think it's an interesting question.
I think it is a super interesting question, a very, very interesting question. I think a lot of work needs to go into this territory, into these questions right now. And I mean, I think it's a very, I think there's a lot of opportunity for architectural expertise to find new avenues around questions like this. Right, like I think that I think for architecture to take on and reconceptualize how financial models can be redeployed in relation to both the virtual and the physical, to do kind of what your question's pointing at, I think is a really exciting territory, and potentially very powerful territory for architecture. And I mean, because, you know, I mean, also as we're talking, I mean, architects are more and more going into the metaverse, but they're going into the metaverse not most, or to my knowledge, without the interests that we're discussing right now. So, you know, like in Miami right now, I think, like, well, in Miami, it's in the metaverse, but like Zaha Hadid architects are exhibiting their like NFT gallery. Like I know Rex architects in New York are designing a metaverse thing for NFTs, a gallery where Beeple's project will be people's work will be so there are more and more architects who are very active in the physical world beginning to be very active in the virtual world, where they're and the projects on both sides are attached to financial speculative systems. And I think we need more critical creativity being deployed in those spaces.
But I think with this, I don't know exactly the case of Zaha Hadid, but like I imagine that it's closer to the art that, I mean, okay, you have some painting, and that could be like marketed or bought and sale, and it can increase the value. And then I understand why it's also working in the with the NFT in the virtual world, but so long. It was believed that like the difference between art and architecture is that the architecture has some function, and it's 3D and people can use it, and like it has the inner space. So without that, it's not architecture, or it's not the point of the architecture as we are used to. Then it's more an art. And well, art, I guess architects can also do art, but then I wouldn't say that it's architecture. But anyway, I also wanted to ask you, like, how do you like? What do you think about the? You are also an architect, so what's the role of the architects in all of this? Like, how? I mean, I think that many architects are somehow like they're participating on the system, or uh, fueling actually what's going on. And one example is these units, the standardized units, either in the thin towers or maybe at the exurban areas. But then the other way how the architects can serve the financialized architecture are these icon buildings that raise the value of the surroundings. You showed also the Spain pavilion, which was destroyed. I also remember the case of the vessel from New York, which is basically useless completely. And it's an area which is not that well or like it would be inaccessible, or like, okay, it could be an open public space, but why would anyone come there? Because the surrounding was meant only for rich people. But because the bus was built and the tourists came, and then you probably all know that there were some suicides, which I think makes it really interesting what everything an architecture costs. And it was just a symbol of basically of the capital, that someone had so much money that they can use it for a completely useless building. So I'm just thinking, what's the role of the architects, and whether we should do something about it or against it, or we should leave it like that because we have no other option. I don't know. I'm not a practicing architect, so
I think, I mean, it's a great question. I mean, I think we absolutely should be doing something about it. I think, architects have certain forms of agency and not other forms of agency. So clearly, the challenges, the very serious challenges that are related to this whole conversation are immense, and architects clearly do not have the capability to solve this, quote unquote, but no individual profession does. So it's going to take a concerted, critical activism to make that change. And I do think architects play a critical role in it. And what type of things can be done? I think there's a real spectrum, right? Like I think, or there's a real range. I think that architects can advocate and be working hard to design spaces that are not socially disentangled and therefore more abstract and more liquid. I think we should be thinking seriously for how we can design 21st century spaces that have rich and entangled and kind of reasonably messy social milieus. And maybe even, I mean, because we could see the forces of financialization want none of that. They want isolation, single identity, view-oriented, relatively abstract projects. So the more we can make design decisions and advocate for design decisions that are opposite of that is one way we can help. Now, I think also architects, it's difficult, right? Because, you know, people need to support themselves, right? They need to make a living, right? And we are so deeply enmeshed in a system that has these other interests than what I was just describing, that it's very hard for, I think, many architects to not take on work when they need to pay their staff and all of that, where they're working to produce these things that have these effects. But I think architects should increasingly, if they're in the position, consider not taking on work where the outcomes are clear. So if it is a hyper financialized project where it's clear that it's going to be used in a certain way and its outcomes are going to be problematic, I think architects that are in the position to do so, and there are architects that are in position to do so, should really consider refusal to work. And, you know, where do we draw the ethical line? And I've been very influenced in this line of thinking by Peggy Deemer, the really wonderful architectural theoretician and architect in the United States, who's an expert on architecture and capitalism. And, you know, I was in a conversation with her where she was like, you know, a company like Shop should refuse to take on a project like 111 West 57th. And I mean, it's quite interesting if you start imagining like firms that have, you know, are very influential in what they do. I mean, refusing that type of work, it will have an effect. It will have an effect on developers. It will have an effect on other architects. Maybe architects are a profession that are governed by professional organizations around the world, right? State or national. Maybe architects should consider lobbying their professional organizations to make changes to their ethical frameworks. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, architecture has, I mean, what is not unique to finance capitalism is architecture's long-standing, deep relationship with the accumulations of wealth and power, right? I mean, the canonical projects throughout architectural history are largely kind of materializations of this incredible surplus wealth, right? So part of this is maybe architecture's reckoning with its intimate relationship with inequality. And so should we start saying, like, for instance, you know, like, should architects lobby their professional organizations that give out awards to change their award criteria, to say, you know what, like, maybe we should no longer be giving top architecture prizes to projects that are like hyper financialized or obscene kind of wealth storage edifices. You know, it's conceivable that there was a kind of movement where we're like, no, because that perpetuates a system in which architecture is or perpetuates a system where architects perpetuate a system of inequality, and it's connected to every form of racism and every form of sexism and all these things.
I'm actually glad that you brought that up, because I wanted to ask it as the next question, like what, for example, the architecture prizes are good for, or like often there is a discourse that we need architects, or like that anyone should work with architects because the architects give the building. I mean, there is a fight between architects and between architects and engineers, especially in the Czech Republic, that the engineers gets most of the work, most of the project, and then architects don't have work to do living. And so the architect's discourse is that everyone should work with an architect because they are giving the project extra value and it's just better, blah, blah, blah. And then also for that, maybe some of the prizes are created to promote good architecture. But then the question is, what is good architecture? And if that's like, if architects present themselves with projects like, I don't know, those skyscrapers or like projects which served someone with like a very rich person, I think it has it's unrelatable to the general population, and that's why the architects are somehow detached from it, from the society. That like a person would imagine like architect as a kind of enemy because they often works on project which a normal person don't like, that destroys their neighborhood or something. But and also I think it was very interesting discussion when for example Alejandro Aravena became the creator of the Venice Biennale, and it was shortly after he presented this incremental housings which are super, well, okay, maybe not super, but like kind of cheap and for normal families. And then some of the architects would ask, hey, why is this person so promoted and became the creator when he's not that good architect? He just designed some incremental housing project. And I think it's very interesting whether we should promote like what is good architect, or like do we want to promote architects' work which is like somehow special architecture, but it was built with a lot of wealth and serves only a few people, or it would be the kind of Aravena's project, which somehow have the community in mind and maybe even some sustainability. And so well, I just wanted to mention it was really interesting, like this discussion.
Super interesting. And one thing that particularly in what you just said strikes a chord with me is that, you know, there is, I think, a widespread ideology and discourse that positions architecture with a capital A that is connected with a deep interest in form making and aesthetics, like beauty and like formal richness, however we want to explain it. And that at the opposite end is the kind of socially minded architect who you know, holds social values so in such a way that they are not very ambitious or inventive or creative aesthetically and formally, right? There's a, and so the argument around Aravena, you know, receiving the Pritzker Prize and all of that, like, is, you know, like, and what you say at the Venice Biennale, very illustrative of this dichotomy. I think that dichotomy has to radically be confronted and challenged. I think it's unhelpful and false in a way. Like, well, maybe false isn't the right word. I mean, it's the logics for why it exists is understandable, and the positions of, well, but I advocate, like, I am totally a formalist, right? Like, and I think actually these the things we've been discussing today are incredibly formal and aesthetic phenomena. And I think the powerful importance of the architect and the agency of the architect in them is actually to have formally and aesthetically charged ways of working on these issues. It's not, I think, the question of like, oh, formalism is connected to wealth and iconicism, and therefore to get out of this, we have to abandon that. I think actually the way to get to a really important and successful place with this is to be very formally and aesthetically engaged, but with new aims, goals, and aspirations. So how do we make formally and aesthetically sophisticated architecture that enriches the lives of people that are not benefiting from it right now? often. And paradoxically, maybe they're not benefiting it from all ends of the political spectrum. So they're not benefiting from it the kind of like hyper-capitalist architect, because they're designing the projects for the rich people. But then the socially minded architects are kind of typecast to be like, well, we don't do that kind of stuff because we can't. I mean, we're helping the people. You know, so I think I would like to challenge those divisions.
Cool. I would like to ask if anyone from the audience want to join the discussion or have any question. You can either speak directly or type anything in the chat. Okay. Anything? Anyone? Okay. You will miss the chance. We will close the discussion so soon.
That's quite okay. That's quite okay. You and I have had a very rich conversation, and it's great that everyone's coming. And I have to go soon because I have to go to thesis reviews that are happening over here.
Well, yeah, then I will probably close it if no one wants to ask. But I really enjoyed the discussion and the lecture. Thank you very much. And we may stay in email contact. I'll send you the invitation for the other events if you want to join.
Carolina, thank you so much for inviting me, and I very much enjoyed the conversation. And I'm very excited to see and learn more about what you're doing over there. It sounds really great. So yeah, please send me all the links and I'll come if I have time.
Good, thanks. I want to thank also everyone who joined.